that allows you to, hold on just a second here, stop sharing. Well, good morning. I'm glad that you are able to join us. I expect a number of people to continue to join, but we're a couple of minutes after 3, a couple of minutes after 10, the time we set to hold this webinar. I'm really excited to welcome one of our trustees, retired General Donald L. Scott. General has brought forth such passion and enthusiasm. He was a member of the Parks Foundation that spearheaded the efforts for Missouri Parks to create the Battle of Island Mound site. He was a founder of the AmeriCorps program. He ran a decade as CEO of the Library of Congress. Did you not, General?
Yeah, I was deputy librarian for 10 years.
Yes. So the General does not let too much in the way of moss grow under his feet, and never has. And today we have something special to share with you, an opportunity to have a dialogue with General Scott about his newest book. And I'm thrilled to be able to introduce the General and have him share a little bit with you about that book. So General Scott, the floor is yours, and would you like to make some initial remarks?
Well, thank you very much, Jim. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you, Jim, and I want to thank all of you who are, partners and are members of the trustee board for FFNHA for this opportunity to speak about my newest book, American Racism and What You Can Do About It. I will take the first, and I promise to be less than 10 minutes, but I'll take the first 10 minutes of this period to talk to you about why I wrote the book, and give you, just for those who didn't have a chance to read it or buy it, to give you an overview of what the book is all about. And so at the conclusion of those 10 minutes or less, maybe a little bit more, I will be happy and do invite you to ask any questions that you may have associated with the book or its subject matter. Now, I started to think about writing this book right after my wife Betty died in April of 2019. And at that time, I was really through grief and not really knowing what to do with the rest of my life without her. I was thinking about all of the opportunities that God had given she and I for 57 years of our marriage to accomplish and receive a lot of opportunities that a lot of Americans don't have the chance to do so. And so as I was reflecting in those early months about what I was going to write about, COVID-19 was no place in sight when I started trying to write in May of 2019. So COVID-19 was no place in sight, was no place on the horizon. But I did have the sense that race and the topic of race would become a significant issue in the 2020 presidential election. And the reason I had sensed that was, number one, being born an African-American in 1938, I had experienced racism, and my wife had experienced racism. And it just seemed to me that with the election of President Trump and his comments that he made during his campaign was focused on dividing the country rather than bringing it together on the issue of race. And then in August of 2019, as I'm still trying to figure out, what it is I want to write about the book, that was the time that the white supremacists and the neo-Nazi rally occurred in Charlottesville, Virginia. And that was in August of 2019. And at that time, I was pretty much convinced that race was going to become a dominant issue in the 2020 presidential election. And so at that time, I really started to reflect that God had given Betty and myself and all other African Americans as well as Americans the opportunity to enjoy the best of what America had ever been during the formative years of our upbringing. And I say that, starting with, we were seniors in high school in 1954 when the Supreme Court decision integrated public schools. She went to and graduated from Hannibal, Missouri High School, and I graduated from Monroe City, Missouri High School. And we married in 1962. And I spent 30 years in the United States Army and got out in 1991. But my reflection says, if you had to be born at a time in America and you were African American, this was the best time to be born because the civil rights laws and equal opportunity enforcement had given us that opportunity. And at the same time, I'm doing reflecting about the opportunities that we as African Americans, my wife and I and others had. I also realize that God allowed white Americans to create a unique nation with the guiding proposition that all men or people were created equal and endowed by their Creator with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so as I started to reflect on that and those two opportunities, I was inspired to write the book, primarily to appeal to white Americans that the future of American democracy as guided by the Declaration of Independence would be and is at risk in the 2020 upcoming presidential election. And so to tell the story and try to set the stage, I use the accomplishments of what I call the Patriotic Seven. And those of you who saw the front cover of my book will see, and I'm going to try to show it again here. The Patriotic Seven, as I'm showing here, are the 7 Americans, 6 white, 1 black. There's 5 presidents and 2 Supreme Court justices that make up the 7. And of course, in the center is Abraham Lincoln. And on his right, is Harry Truman. The other side would be Dwight Eisenhower. And following on down till you get to Justice Earl Warren. And then on the left, you have Lyndon Johnson, and then Kennedy, and then Thurgood Marshall. Now, the reason I put those in that order is because I think the one who did the most to help create the kind of multiracial, multicultural America that we enjoy today was Abraham Lincoln. And then next of importance, I thought, was Harry Truman. And the rest were important, but they were just filling out the term that are the issues that Truman and Lincoln had started. And so I am pleased to say that the America that you and I enjoy is an America that these 7, in my view, these 7 moved forward with the founder's proposition that all are created equal and endowed with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And they have done more to give us that than any of the presidents and or others in our history in the country. And we now find ourselves at the threshold of either electing a president in 2020 who will continue the self-evident truths that the founders sought, and or will go a different direction away from democracy as we know it and into some form of perhaps autocracy that would take us far away from where it was that the founders thought we needed to be. And so with that, I will take questions and encourage you to ask any question that you may have in regards to the book that I just gave you an overview of. Thank you so much.
Thank you, General Scott. Very much appreciated. For those of you who are participating, I have enabled your screens and your ability to unmute yourself to ask any questions you might want to ask. And while you're checking on those mute buttons and enabling your screens, I do have a couple of questions to throw your way, General Scott. And one of them I think is most intriguing. How is American racism different from the racism that happens in other countries?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question because I had to give that a lot of thought. And what came to mind during my research and my experience is America is the only country that I know of who has as its founding proposition this notion that the country will be the kind of place that regards all people as being created equal by, and as the founders used it, by God and by nature's God. And that all people would be given the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We are the only country on planet Earth that has that as its guiding principle. And even though when the country was founded in 1776, there was slavery, and even though Native Americans were not included in the We the People project or picture, and even though women of any color could not vote, that proposition was the proposition that guided this nation and all of its elected officials over the period of our 243 year history. And so that's why I think we're different.
Thank you, General. Are there other questions from the audience? If you would like to ask a question, please unmute yourself and feel free to present it to the General.
Good morning, Jim.
Good morning, George. How are you?
I'm well. You?
I'm doing well. Thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure. General Scott,
Yes.
race relations in America has openly changed during the last few years. Can you parallel this period with any other period in the U.S. history that seemed to reflect what we're seeing today?
George, give me a moment to just think about that. And I really, cannot think of a period other than, I think the closest to my research in history and perhaps my experiencing in the reality of life in America, perhaps would be when John Kennedy was elected the president. And of course, this was right after, Harry Truman had integrated the military, and Dwight Eisenhower Supreme Court had declared that public schools would be integrated. And the period, and I talk about this in my book, the critical period for President Eisenhower was to either use the office of the presidency to enforce the ruling of the court and or to do nothing. And if he had done nothing, then Little Rock schools, which were the test case, for whether America was going to be followed by laws or whether it was going to stick to the dictates of those who did not want integration, racial integration. The choice was then and there. And as you'll read in the section that I devote to President Eisenhower, President Eisenhower was really not into using force to integrate for racial integration. And it was his attorney general, who was the driving force to say, Mr. President, you have to do this because this is the Supreme Court is the law of the land. And, we know how it turned out. And we know that Little Rock eventually did integrate, even though they closed the school system down for one whole year after it had been forced to integrate. But I think that moment, to me, characterizes the two Americas that have always existed, and particularly among white Americans. And the two factions were led by the Southern governors who was using everything that they could to say that race mixing would destroy America. And the majority of the white people in the South were silent, but being silent was on the side of those who did not want change. And so I think where we were then and where we are now is a deciding point. And if we don't have a president, in my view, in this election, who will take us back to the quest for a country that believes not only that all people are created equal and entitled to the rights of life and liberty, but also that everyone who is an American citizen is entitled to equal justice under the law. I don't know if that's a good answer, but it's the best I can come up with.
Well, it's amazing. Thank you.
Thank you, George. I've got another question from our audience. General, I would like you to explain the importance and the style that Chief Justice Warren utilized in attaining a unanimous decision in Brown, and why that unanimous decision was so important.
Well, yeah, that is a great opportunity for me to express my deep appreciation for leadership. Leadership as shown by Chief Justice Warren. Now, just a little bit of history here that I discovered. President Eisenhower really wanted a Chief Justice who was a scholar. Warren was not a scholar. Warren's claim to fame was the first governor of California to have been elected 3 times. And he had also thought about running for president, but Eisenhower wanted a younger person and selected Richard Nixon from California. And so, but Eisenhower appreciated Warren's support and had promised that at some point he would consider him, Warren, for an appointment on the Supreme Court, particularly maybe not as the Chief Justice, but would consider. Well, that did happen. And here's why I think Warren's leadership was so very critical importance and is worthy of being emulated and studied. Earl Warren knew that he was not a scholar, but when he came in, he understood people, and he understood people from the standpoint that he needed to have the wisdom of all of those who were on the Supreme Court in order for him to be able to just understand what it was that he was charged to accomplish. And so his technique was to come in, and I've forgotten the name of the senior associate justice, I think it was Blackmun, but he came in and he talked to the senior associate justice, and he said, look, essentially, I'm new. I just want to find out how things work here. I'd like for you to continue to run the business of the Supreme Court until I can get my feet on the ground. I'd also like for you to accompany me to each one of the chambers of the associate justices, because I want to hear from them. I want to hear what their concerns are. I want to hear, how they view the issues confronting the court. And through that process, he was able to, one, gain the confidence and appreciation of the Chief Justice, because he was willing to listen. And then when it came, after he had listened to him and they had talked about the cases looming before the Supreme Court, and this school segregation thing was at the top of it. So when it came time for him to convene and for them to approach how they were going to handle it, he made one statement that showed not only his grasp of understanding of the American Constitution, but of understanding of human nature. And the question he put to the other justices was that the only way that you could justify a continuation of separate but equal schools in America was if you believed that one group of people, and in this case, the Negro race, was inferior to all other races. That was the one issue he put before his fellow justices that got them all on board to say they didn't believe that any one race was inferior to the other. And from then on, it was masterful the way that Chief Justice Warren was able to bring all of the associate justices to the point that they voluntarily agreed to a unanimous decision. Great job of leadership.
Thank you, General. Jody Craig has joined us, our past board chair, and want to welcome her. And Jody, you'd raised your hands to ask a question. Would you go ahead now?
Yes, thank you, Jim, and good morning, General. Quick question. In thinking about the history that you have described in the book and the importance of leadership, are there effective and particularly are there brief ways that one can use history to help influence people's thinking about where we are today and how we move forward from this place?
Well, yeah, thank you. Thanks, Jody. And it's good to hear your voice. Thanks for checking in. Would you just say what you want me to comment on again?
Sure. I think that we have opportunities to interact with people, but usually we only have a matter of minutes. And so we are not able to convey the full story or history of what has gone on in the past in relation to Blacks in America and the inequalities. So I'm looking for ways we can use history as kind of quick anecdotes or easy storylines to grasp that will help people move forward. Does that make sense? And maybe there aren't any.
Well, yeah, I think I do get the import of your question, and though I cannot, I cannot think of one instance that would be beneficial to all peoples in making an impact in the life of a nation. I can think of many incidents that one person has made made a significant difference in the way others are treated and regarded, especially in situations in which there is discrimination of race, class, gender, or any kind of discrimination. And on a macro stage, I am so taken with President Abraham Lincoln, his humanity.
Mm-hmm.
I am so taken with the process he went through to educate himself amidst the contemporary issues of his day, which racism against African Americans, Negroes, was the acceptance fact in the society. And because of this individual, who grew up poor, who lost his mom when he was about 9 or 10 years old, and he and his sister was left to live in a wilderness for about a month while the dad went off to find another wife. Now, here's why I think this is so important in shaping an individual's life. It was they didn't have any neighbors. He and his sister had no neighbors they could go to within miles of where their cabin was. They had just buried their mom, which she was out there close to the cabin. And he chronicles in his early upbringing how fearful and frightful it was at nighttime because of wolves and bears and blah, blah, blah. All of that threatening their actual survival. But they survived. And so as Lincoln gets to the point that he is teaching himself law, and as he gets to the point that he is running for the office of president, he begins to do what most Americans are trained or expected to do. He begins to express to his fellow voters, his fellow citizens, his beliefs in the equality of men. And he is the first president that I know of who in his speeches harkened back to the founder's statement about this country being created equal. And he was the first of his generation to bring in the question of slavery and how un-American that it really was. And so we could fast forward to say that Lincoln, as the individual, had tried everything he could to make the issue of slavery go away, all the way from trying to get rid of all African Americans by sending them back to Liberia or sending them to a colony down in South America someplace, calling in a group, and I talk about this in the book, but calling in a group of free blacks and reasoning with them in a very civil manner that their race and his race, the white race, really wasn't compatible, and it would be good for them just go away. And he would help go away because he would get some money to get some ships and so forth and send them away. Man was being honest with himself. But when all of that fell through, and he had no choice but to decide how to save the Union, this man of humanity chose to say that the only way that we could do this is that all people have to be regarded as citizens and treated equal and fairly. And so we get the 13th, the 14th, and 15th Amendment because one man born in humble experiences had the courage to use his individual beliefs to share with the rest of a nation. Fast forward, Donald Scott is born in 1938. in Missouri, racial segregation deviated my life and the lives of African Americans from the lives of white Americans. There were certain jobs that Negroes were not supposed to have because of their race. I am a 12, 13-year-old youngster, and I'm driving a hay truck because that's the kind of job in a rural area that blacks and of course many other whites, had. But for a black, that was about the best you was going to be able to come up with, unless you worked on the railroad or unless you was a farmhand someplace. And so here we go. I had a nephew who was from Detroit, Michigan, and his uncle owned a print shop, and he had learned how to use picas and set type and do all that. So he comes to Monroe City, Missouri, and he's bold enough to walk into the local office, get himself a job for the summer, and then he's bold enough to tell him when he leaves that he's got an uncle, me, that could do the same job. The woman who owned the newspaper interviewed me, gave me the job, and that job changed the trajectory of my life. And so, Jody, here's what I'm getting, and I want you to get, and all of you to get out of what I'm saying. In America, we all are given a voice to speak truth as we understand it. If we don't use our voice, regardless of whether we are high up on the totem pole or low on the totem pole, then the whole will never listen to the masses. The minority view will always be heard, and especially if the minority view is denigrating one group against another, or denigrating one sex against another, or denigrating one social class against another social class. So I think the way out for America is every person, regardless of who you are, black, white, Latino, man, woman, gay, straight, if you have human decency, and especially if you are a Christian and you believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ, and you have read the Sermon on the Mount, you have to speak up. And you will make a difference if you're speaking from this position of humanity. Long answer, but I thank you for it.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us, Jody. I want to remind everyone, I hope you have it up on your screen. General Scott's book is American Racism, What You Can Do About It, The Hard Truth About America and Americans. It's available pretty much any of the services which you can order a book. This page happens to be from Amazon. If you do purchase the book through the smile.amazon.com and designate Freedom's Frontier as your designated 501c3, you will also be asking Amazon to make a contribution to a very small one, but one we appreciate nevertheless, to Freedom's Frontier. I have a couple of people with their hands up, General. I'd like to start with Johnny szlauderbach of the Freedom's Frontier staff, who had a question.
Hi, General Scott.
Hi, Johnny.
Yeah, from a certain perspective, the last 4 years this is admittedly nihilistic perspective, but the past 4 years have shown that the whole post-war concept of progress has bred as much resentment as it has tolerance and decency. And I mean, even beyond the overt examples, I mean, Trump's approval rating, I mean, is a solid 40%, has been. But beyond those overt examples of racism, I mean, even the Chief Justice of the Supreme court, the current one, thinks that racism has been solved. What, in your opinion, does the way forward look like? Is there a way forward? Are those 40% of Americans, forgive the use of the term, but a lost cause?
Johnny, thanks. What I think I got out of your question, is there a way forward? How do we go forward? I believe we go forward, one, by knowing a little bit about the history of our country. And what I recommend to you and everyone else, we must know our history. And in this book, the reason that I chose these 7 people, and especially Harry Truman, the reason that I say that is because when you look at America and what was going on between the races at the time Harry Truman was president, there were, and particularly in the South and the border states, there were still lynchings going on. There was still mass violence against African Americans. And the mood of the country with regards to race was really one that just among white Americans was largely one of, don't make a big deal out of this. I mean, America had been racist, to put it in gross terms, for by then about 180 years or something. And so just don't make a big deal out of it. And so Harry Truman, the guy who grew up, right here in Missouri, and who was very proud of his Southern heritage. Harry Truman got to the point as one individual who was president of the United States, where he just was so upset over the inhumanity of the lynchings and the killings of African Americans that he chose, at the stroke of a pen, to take all the heat from his white colleagues, and especially those that lived in the South, to do the right thing. And so the way forward, when you do the right thing, you're gonna incur the ire of a whole lot of people. But if you are a person of character and integrity, who loves humanity, regardless of whether you love every individual or not, but if you love humanity and you believe in the quality of our being, then you make the right choice. Harry Truman made the right choice. And he made the right choice at a time in which he had to go against many of his white fellow citizens in order to achieve the better for the whole. Dwight Eisenhower did the same thing. John Kennedy did the same thing. Lyndon Johnson did the same thing. And we have individuals who in the last couple of years have not made the same tough choices that are required to be made in this election in 2020. And so, yes, we have a way forward. And the way forward in our history is to go forward, making America not only equal opportunity for everyone who wants to put will to shoulder, but equal justice as well. Thanks, Johnny.
Thank you, General. And we now have a question from Forrest, who asks, how do you think the post-Civil War time in both the Grant and Hayes administrations educate us for today about the orderly transfer of power from one president to another?
Yeah, I really don't feel competent to enough to know about the Grant transition, because I haven't researched that much. And so I'd rather not speculate on that.
All right then. And now turning to a different Grant. His is Grant Glenn, and he has a question for you.
Okay.
Great segue. First of all, I want to thank you, General, for your book. I have found it enlightening, and I was motivated while you were speaking to get on the Amazon page and write a review. And I would encourage our listeners who have bought the book to do so, to help the General's ratings that look pretty stellar, but more reviews, the better. Going back to your response on Truman, I would like you to tell the story of what really motivated and enlightened him, in lieu of the fact that I think that technology has played an important part in changing public opinion in the last 50 years, in particular, when we look at what the brutalities that were occurring during the civil rights movements of the 60s, and how those were brought to the news, how Vietnam, when it started to be filmed and brought home, the rise of the tide against the war increased. And today we have camera phones taking videos of these atrocities that make them so much more real than just reading about something that may or may not have happened to somebody. The videos make them more or less irrefutable, and how that has changed public opinion. But going back to Harry Truman, I think it's a great story.
Yeah, thanks, Grant. Let me just kind of share with you how I happened to really focus on Harry Truman, and in a large sense, this event really gave me some structure towards writing the book. As I said earlier, when my wife died in April of 2019, I was really devastated, even though I accepted with great appreciation that death happens to us all. And even better appreciation that when you are given the opportunity to live with a person and share with a person, who helps you to improve your humanity, to understand all things, then it's quite natural that the loss of that person creates a big void in your life. Well, this void in my life, and I think it was during the month of May, a friend of mine whom my wife and I had met on an airplane coming from Las Vegas, and he's white, by the way, but he stayed in touch with both of us and came to the house to visit with my wife to check on her. And when she died, he was at the funeral. And later he told me that he and I needed to have breakfast once a week because I needed structure in my life. And at our first breakfast meeting, he mentioned to me that there was going to be a program down at the Truman Library. He wasn't able to go, but he said it's something that I think you'd be interested in because I've heard you talk about, race relations and that sort of thing. So I go, and at this program, there was a speaker. I forgot his first name, but his last name is Gurgel, and he was talking about a book that he had written about Harry Truman, and the book was titled Unexampled Courage, which is kind of an odd title, and you'd have to read the book to really appreciate it. But in this book, he talked about, how Harry Truman was moved by the death or by the injuring of this African-American soldier who had come from World War II, who had his eyes put out by a white sheriff in the South, and how that one incident, when briefed to President Truman had so moved him about the inhumanity that had been going on among two African Americans in the South, that he was the one who decided that enough was enough. And in his very Harry Truman way, he said enough is enough, and that's when he decided that he was going to end segregation at the objection of all of the Southern Democrats. And even when he decided to sign the executive order to integrate the United States Army, the generals and Eisenhower and there was a couple other, 5 stars, went to him and says, wrong, don't do that, won't work. Truman had the nerve to say, it will work and you're going to make it work. And so after listening to President, to that talk about President Truman, the author says, anybody who has a comment, we take it to this time. Well, I raised my hand. And when I was called on, I simply said that when President Truman signed the executive order in 1948, I was a 10-year-old Negro in Northeast Missouri, had no intention of joining the Army at the time. But in 1991, I retired as a brigadier general, thanks to President Truman. And so, Grant, I tell that story because what we do with our power at the moment will have reverberations in history that we cannot even imagine 10, 15, 20 years from now. In the case of the story with President Harry Truman, the effort that he took showed itself, in the progress that the country has made, not only in race relations, but also in terms of world leadership. People still look to the United States of America, as the shining star upon the hill, because it is the one country that has shown, especially in the last 100 or so years, that we're not perfect, but we as a country have leaders who are willing to do the hard decisions that protects this thing that we call democracy. And so I hope I didn't get too lost in trying to explain the Truman impact on me as an American, and especially an American from Missouri. I am proud to be in Missouri. And Harry Truman and Berta Lee Nolan and Coach Billy Key and a few others have made me proud because they, as white Americans, stepped up along with my mom, my dad, and other African Americans to give me the chance that America gives to all people. Thanks, Grant.
Thank you.
Thank you, Grant. And now Carolyn Burton has raised her hand and has unmuted herself. Carolyn, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, I'd like to know, do you have a general idea how to get the young people engaged more in what's going on? And also, I know that a lot of them don't know the history about the vote. And I'm in several organizations where we're trying to engage them, but do you have any ideas where we can get the young people on board, and so we can, as older people, can step back a little more?
Yeah, thanks, Carolyn, and I'm glad that you raised the young people because, my sense of the young people is twofold. I mean, it's like there's two sides of every coin, and on one side of the coin, as far as humanity is concerned, I think the young people don't have the same kind of issues with race as us older people have, because they have, for better or for worse, and I think it's been for the better, they have attended public schools that are largely racially integrated. And so they don't have issues. I don't see that they have issues with getting along with each other on the basis of race. I think that the ingredient missing with most young people is education. And I think it's hurting and harming the future of America, because our schools, in my opinion, are not teaching young people, how to just do the basic understanding of civics, of how communities run, how communities work, the requirements to vote and the importance of voting, the requirements of making decisions as deciding what issues will have the greatest impact against my family, my social class. I don't think that we do enough to teach young people how to do that. And I certainly know that we're not doing enough to teach young people how to do math and English, and to be able to pass those requirements that will allow some who may want to get into the military, how to get in. Because right now, there's about 70% of all high school graduates in America who cannot pass the entrance exam to get into any of our military forces. And when you stop to think about that, that is staggering. And it's staggering because if we don't have people capable of doing math and English to take care of the critical skills that we need in the military, in today's military, are high tech. And even though you don't really have to be a whiz when it comes to using calculators and yardsticks and all, you do have to have some critical thinking ability. So I think, I'm okay with the young people, humanity. I'm not okay that we, as the older Americans, are trying to teach and are teaching the young people of what it takes to be a good citizen and what it takes to know, how the issues affect each one of us. And I'm not talking about Twitter, getting on Twitter and understanding something. I'm not talking about using email. I'm talking about making sure that we understand how to bring out the inquisitiveness of young people so that they want to know, how to be able to figure, how to be able to do the things that bring out their own creative talents. Thanks, Carolyn.
Thank you.
In general, we have another question from George Pettigrew. George, you're unmuted. Go right ahead.
Okay, thank you. I would appreciate your insight on this, General. It was in 1948 that President Truman signed Executive Order 9981. And it was about 4 years later in Korea, around 1952, that the desegregation actually began to take place, as best I understand. How is it, in your view, that the Commander-in-Chief's executive order took 4 years to implement?
George, thank you so much for that question, because that's the nub of the problem. You can issue an order, but if it involves the disturbance or the interruption of human interaction in their everyday affairs, then you are going to have some leadership among the common folk in order for that to happen. A case in point, when Truman signed that executive order that it was all going to be integrated, we still had military forces that was made up primarily, and we still had the draft. And primarily, most of the people who came to the Army and in positions of leadership were from the South. And just because you give somebody a commission or put some stripes on them won't change their attitudes about race, gender, that they have been brought up in all of their lives. And so, for example, George, when I came in the Army in 1960, the Army had been racially integrated since 1948, but equality had not seeped in. And even though as a lieutenant, which is what I was when I came in the Army, I was given charge of a company of about 300 people down at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. I had a first sergeant who was from the South, and he has still held some remnants of racial superiority. And I remember him coming in my office shortly after I had been sworn in as company commander, carrying what we then called the morning report. And the morning report was a piece of paper that had a breakdown of the ethnicity and by rank of all of the people that made up the company. And this first sergeant took great delight in asking me, though he was polite, but in a very upstart kind of way, Lieutenant, I don't know if you've ever seen this kind of report that you've got to sign. I said, what is it, First Sergeant? He said, it's the morning report. And let me explain to you how it works. And he was right. I had never had to fill out the morning report because the only thing I had to do as an officer was sign its accuracy. But he took great delight in saying, okay, on this side is all of the colored people in the company, and you're over here as one of the colored, even though that you are the commander. And then all of the sergeants, colored sergeants over on this side. Over on this side is all of the whites. I'm over here. I'm the chief, blah, blah, blah. And he says, I just wanted you to know that that's the way. The point of that being is that we still had individuals in the Army who were not willing to let that go. And it took not only from 1948, but it took until 1980 for the United States military to finally get rid of most of the vestiges of racism, to create an organization that promoted and rewarded its military forces on the basis of knowledge and proficiency. And had it not been for the chief of staff of the Army in 1973, who decided that coming out of Vietnam, the Army and the military was so racially divided that we could not become efficient unless we totally changed. And there was an all-out push to educate every non-commissioned officer, every officer, and every civilian to what it took to achieve an racially proficient, equal structure within the military. So, George, human nature requires leadership to change attitudes. And it always has, and I believe it always will. That's why, to me, it's very important to have a chief executive who understands, one, the authority to use the power to do the right thing for all of the people that you're responsible for, and two, to be able to demonstrate through his or her appointments that we have people who look like America, who's capable and appointed to do what it is that the country needs to have done in the executive branch, the legislative branch, judicial branch. And just when you look at the formation of the cabinet of the United States, you see a stark absence of racial diversity along those lines. Thank you, George.
Thank you.
And we may have one final question. I noticed that Craig Patterson has unmuted his microphone. Craig, do you have a question for the general?
No, I don't think so. I appreciate you noticing that.
All right, then. Thank you, Craig. Well, we're at the hour mark, and we had promised that we would not give you any more Zoom fatigue, but certainly a presentation by General Scott and an opportunity to ask him questions about his new book are a treat and certainly not fatiguing. I'd remind you again, and sharing this screen, the book is American Racism and What You Can Do About It. It's available from all major booksellers and can be delivered to your home or electronically if you'd like. General Scott, we certainly appreciate you joining us today for our partner meeting, and want to thank everyone for being with us, and hope you have a wonderful, cool November-like day here, still in the summer in September. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, everybody.